acho que não temos tempo, mas acho que
The urgency to address climate change is now. Decarbonizing the power sector is a critical step. The world has been searching for affordable, carbon-free power that is always on. And now it's here. This is the BWRX 300, a small modular reactor designed by GE Hitachi. The patented innovative design can provide affordable carbon-free power this decade. Want to learn more? Go to nuclear.gepower.com.
Bom dia a todos. Sejam bem-vindos ao terceiro e último dia do NT2R.
Good morning to you all and welcome to NT2E's third day.
É com imenso prazer que eu estou aqui hoje para mediar o Nuclear Talks.
My name is Denise Luna, and I am a journalist from Agência Estado, and it is with great pleasure to be here to mediate the nuclear talks, this innovative meeting for our sector, which started yesterday. And with today's topic, we are talking about new sites for nuclear power plants in Brazil. With us today will be Mr. Ivan Dibov from Rosatom Latin America, Tina Taylor, Director of EPRI, Mr. Amilcar Guerreiro, President of CEPEL, and Ricardo Fraga Guterres, Director of the Directorate of Radio Protection and Nuclear Safety at the National Nuclear Energy Commission, also known as CNEN. And to comment and discuss the speeches of our guests, I wanted to invite Mr. Leonam Guimarães, President of Electronuclear and member of the Permanent Advisory Group on Nuclear Energy at the IAEA. Hi, Leonam. Good morning to you all. It's really great to be here with you. It's wonderful to be with you every year, yes. The topic is rather important and relevant today, and I think that it's important to say that in 2007, the Ministry of Energy and Mines opened the study into the sites for nuclear power plants for the 2050 National Energy Plan. And this basically was a declaration of the political will of our government. And so we started our studies on different sites. And this was based on different studies that were done by EPI, which is a state-owned company. In last year, in fact, the Ministry of Mines and Energy launched the 2050 Energy Plan. And this topic came up again, this whole idea of nuclear generation. And according to the ministry, we decided to start working with CEPEL on our studies for locating new sites. And this topic will come up again and again because it's basically warming up, particularly now that we've just dealt with in 2011 the Fukushima meltdown. We're considering dozens of candidate locations throughout Brazil. Thank you so much for this opportunity to start us off here. Thank you, Leonam. And it's great to have you here. Just like yesterday, you can also participate by sending questions through the chat, which is in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And you can also stay tuned because we're going to launch a poll. We want your opinion about this and many other topics. I also wanted to remind you that we have simultaneous interpretation for this session, and so if you're listening in English, you can hear the whole program in English, and in Portuguese, you'll do the same. And for our debate, I'd like to invite Mr. Ivan Dibov from Rosatom Latin America to bring us an example of how the choice of locations for floating nuclear power plants occurs in the model developed by Rosatom. Thank you, Ivan.
Hello, bom dia. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to participate in this event today and share with you experience of Rosatom. As you know, that Rosatom is realizing big program of construction nuclear power plants, not only inside Russia but also abroad. Now we constructed inside Russia 3 units of nuclear power plant and abroad 35 units of nuclear power plant. This topic, like choosing site, is very actual for Russia because when actually I came to Rosatom more than 15 years ago, share of nuclear energy in energy mix was about 12%, but now it's 20%. So Rosatom constructed during this time several nuclear power plants, and all these nuclear power plants was constructed with all procedure, international procedure that following choosing of the site. But I believe the main topic is two main things. It's safety and economical efficiency, because now, first of all, you need to construct nuclear power plants where you need clean, stable, and big source of energy. But in the same time, now modern technology allowed to make some changes in construction that allowed to construct nuclear power plants in some difficult areas in terms of maybe seismic, but you need to analyze and you need to find balance between safety and between economical efficiency. And Rosatom also now have a unique experience about placing of SMR. As you know, we have an exploitation first SMR floating power plant that placed in Pevek. And now we about to construct first SMR onshore that will be in Yakutia region. So we will follow all this procedure that required to choose site, including public hearing and etc. And we're really happy to share this experience with our colleague and with partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dibon, for starting our discussion today and by presenting such a successful example. It's a very incredible example that you're providing us. Now, today, folks, those of you who have been with us, you've been listening to us for 2 years about the nuclear sector. Now we're going to get started really early on with our poll because we want your opinions. Basically, nuclear energy has makes up 2.5% of our national electric system. But in your opinion, how much space should it occupy? 1, less than 5%. 2, between 5 and 10%. 3, between 10 and 20%, and 4, above 20%. Keep in mind that to those of you who are watching us through the transmission, will have to press on the right. You can start sending us questions too, but this poll is going to be open until before we start the Q&A. But we really would like your opinions. And to continue with our theme, in 2002, ERPI developed a guide for site selection, and it was the guide that Brazil used for the studies that were done last year. Since then, it has been more than 10 years, and the scenario has changed a lot, especially with the emergence of Generation 4 reactors, SMRs. With this in mind, we invited Tina Taylor, director of EPRI, to answer a few questions and bring us up to date with the new guide focused on the future generations of reactors. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you for having me this morning. It's wonderful to be here virtually. I of course, would prefer to be in person with all of you. I will spend a few minutes and give a little overview on EPRI's siting guide, and then happy to participate in discussion. So selecting a nuclear site, of course, is one of the first decisions made in a nuclear power plant project. And it's one of the most important decisions, not only to the success of getting the site licensed and then constructed, but also plays a very important role in the ultimate operation and costs and success of the plant as part of the community. As was mentioned, EPRI developed siting guidance and a framework for how to go about this in the early 1990s, and it has been successfully applied in over 20 countries around the world for the last 25 years. The framework essentially includes a 5-step process where you go from considering a very large region and narrow that down to smaller areas that are of interest, all the time excluding areas that don't meet the criteria or the preferred characteristics and looking for areas that do. So for example, you might exclude areas where there is high seismic activity, and you may be seeking areas where there's adequate cooling water. The framework incorporates not only the economic and technical and cost considerations related to the plant and the design, but also is a way to include socioeconomic factors, environmental considerations, and health and safety. So as you are narrowing down these selections, you use a framework that incorporates many criteria and then weighting factors on those criteria so you can determine the relative importance of different factors. And this criteria weighting can really be an excellent way to incorporate stakeholder input by together working with many groups on what's most important. Most of the experience with this guidance so far has been on siting large light water reactors, where there's a lot of common desirable and undesirable characteristics. So for example, with large light water reactors, you're oftentimes trying to be away from population centers and other industrial facilities, and looking for areas with adequate cooling water can be one of the paramount concerns. But I'll end my initial remarks here with some thoughts that things are changing very rapidly. The criteria and the weighting of these criteria are changing as new technologies become available and as we go through societal changes. So for example, in recent months, we've seen many new announcements that change the types of sites we might be looking for and the technologies we might be using. Yvonne just mentioned floating reactors, which will have a completely different set of considerations. In the US, Bill Gates recently announced that their first TerraPower Natrium reactor will be built on a retiring coal site. This summer, many industries like Bitcoin mining are seeking clean, reliable energy and are partnering with nuclear. There was an announcement last month with Oklo, a microreactor developer, and Compass, a Bitcoin mining company, to partner together. And then I would say that no conversation right now about a low carbon future is complete without discussions related to hydrogen. And almost all the discussions related to hydrogen bring in the potential for nuclear to play a key role in generating carbon-free hydrogen to help energize the rest of the economy. I believe this same framework can use for these new technologies and these new societal desires, as long as stakeholders work together to identify the most important elements and weigh that into the framework and the siting decisions. I look forward to the rest of the discussion and any questions.
Thank you so much for your comments here, Ms. Taylor, for providing the basis for the discussion of our studies in Brazil. Leonel, the audience is already sending us some questions, but I'd like to bring you back in so that you can tell us a little bit more about what these our two presenters, Tita Taylor and Ivan Dibov, just talked about. Well, basically, I think that especially Tina's comments and Ivan's comments just touched on some of the most crucial points, which is that we need to change the paradigm right now. We need to select sites, and this kind of site selection is always based on, looking at large light water reactors and structured based on that. And that makes up about 90% of our nuclear electric generation around the world. But we're going to have a paradigm shift with microreactors and SMRs. So the whole topic of site selection suddenly changes and broadens because we can be more specific, and everything depends on the type of reactor that we're thinking about. Anybody who focuses on this topic is always considering these very specific issues. What we're imagining right now is the idea that site selection is based on the paradigm from the past, which are large light water reactors. And so the site selection is always based on that paradigm. And now we need to change our mind a little and shift how we think about these things when it comes to site selection. So we no longer have to think about the current situation, which is constantly thinking about large size reactors. But now we have to think about the idea of clusters of SMRs. And this would be a new consideration, and it seems that we are starting to reach a new level of updating this idea for site selection. Now, as was just mentioned, we just heard about Bill Gates and the TerraPower. Basically, that's going to change the paradigm, and all of this is going to be studied case by case, because suddenly we have new proposals that are very different and will require different situations for each case. And so everyone's making a great effort, and we're going to have to make even greater strides to address this in a broader way, to select sites based on the specific conditions. And of course, we have this floating reactor idea, which is also very new for us because we're used to the idea of having a fixed site on land instead of a floating site. And so basically, I think that this, from my perspective, and from a global perspective, we have to think of things in a broader context. And we also have to ask many questions about what's the right site for the right reactor. Okay, we've already started to select some questions from the audience, and then we are going to now pass on to a commercial. And before we hear speeches by CEPAL's President Amilcar Guerreiro and the Director of SIN and Director at Radio Protection, Ricardo Fragas Gutierrez, stay with us.
Energy for Life. Ross Adam.
Hoje, no mundo moderno, todos dependem do bom funcionamento de um sistema de fornecimento de energia elétrica para realizar suas atividades. E por isso, estamos presentes na sua vida todos os dias, mesmo que você não perceba. Por enquanto. Pra gente, o foco tem que estar em você. Desde 1974, o CEPEL faz parte dos bastidores do cotidiano de milhões de brasileiros, atuando na pesquisa, desenvolvimento sustentável e inovação do setor elétrico em todo o país. Aliamos conhecimento nacional e internacional de excelência técnica e aplicamos a cada etapa da cadeia elétrica. Geração, transmissão, distribuição e comercialização de energia. E tudo isso sempre levando em conta as necessidades específicas do Brasil. Um país de dimensões continentais, enorme potencial energético e sistema de transmissão interligado norte a sul, que requer soluções tecnológicas inovadoras e adequadas à sua realidade. Por isso, o CEPEL exerce um papel fundamental como Centro Nacional de Pesquisas em Sistemas e Equipamentos, que propiciam uma grande economia ao setor elétrico brasileiro, ao promover sua autonomia tecnológica, além de contribuir para ampliar o acesso à energia elétrica, melhorar a qualidade e a eficiência da energia elétrica consumida e incorporar novas fontes renováveis que impactam menos o meio ambiente. Somos o maior centro de pesquisas do Hemisfério Sul, com mais de 30 laboratórios altamente equipados. Muitos deles únicos em toda a América Latina. Toda essa infraestrutura possibilita o desenvolvimento de soluções tecnológicas e realização de serviços especializados, que geram um grande valor a nossos associados, clientes e parceiros. Entre elas, a viabilização de sistemas próprios de monitoramento e diagnóstico de equipamentos e instalações, e de avaliação de qualidade de energia, e modelos computacionais que são utilizados para a programação da operação do sistema elétrico brasileiro e para o cálculo do preço da energia no mercado. E muitas destas soluções podem ser adaptadas e utilizadas em outros setores produtivos. Mas tanto conhecimento não pode ficar restrito ao nosso centro de pesquisas. Precisa ser difundido. Por isso, realizamos treinamentos e eventos técnicos, além de parcerias tecnológicas com universidades e centros de pesquisa nacionais e internacionais. São quase 50 anos realizando um trabalho de excelência, o que nos dá a credibilidade necessária para assumir um papel inovador não somente no setor elétrico, como também na vida de cada brasileiro. CEPEL, a pesquisa que constrói o futuro.
Muito obrigada por permanecer conosco.
Thank you so much. We're back in the studio now. Considering that we wouldn't be able to implement and position new sources of energy without proper studies, our next guest is Amilcar Guerreiro, president of CEPEL, a research center in electric energy linked to Eletrobras. Welcome, Amilcar. Can you tell us a little bit about how CEPEL is preparing to actively participate in the development of future nuclear power plants in Brazil? First of all, good morning to you all. Thank you. Good morning, Tina and Ivan. Good morning, Ricardo, Leonam, everyone. It's great to see you all. It's been a long time that I haven't seen you, right, Denise? Now, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'd also like to appreciate Celso Cunha, president of ABDEN, for making this event possible. Leonam mentioned the plan, the 2030 plan, and then he talked about the need for nuclear energy. Back in 2007, I was there helping out in the planning. And since then, what we've seen are important developments in the electric sector in Brazil. We've seen growth in the number of renewable sources of energy that are very good. They are they're carbon neutral, but they still lack a permanent and continuous source of electro generation. And so back in 2007, we already were aware of the importance of nuclear energy, but now we see a new electric sector that is facing new challenges. Particularly, we're looking for low carbon emission sources of energy. And also, we look at hydrogen as part of the route forward, since it also helps us with the net zero carbon emissions and goals that we have. And so electricity is always going to be very high in demand, and now we need to find clean ways of producing it. I think that we are all getting ready to help out with the site selection. That's what CEPEL is working on right now. And we've been working on this for some 10 years. And we've been looking at safety of nuclear sites as one of the objectives for the site studies. And this comes into one of the factors of the social and environmental issues that come up in our studies. We also have to consider the OPEX that we spend on the installation of this plant. The other things that come up are that we have to make sure that these new sites are in the optimal locations and that they can make the most of the transmission lines that they're working with. Looking at the EPRI study guide, we see that we have 4 different dimensions that have to be connected to site selection. One is health and safety, the environment, the economical issue, and the engineering and cost issue. And so I think that what would be very important to help in this issue, in the environment issue, and the engineering and cost issues, these are 2 topics that I want to talk about. On the environment side, we have some tools that can be used for the evaluation of the site and the evaluation of the connection of this plant, be it a large-sized plant or a cluster of modular reactors. But we have a tool called BR3 that will be used in these studies. On the engineering and cost side of things, we also have tools for evaluation and analysis of the network and the grid, basically looking at the financial and the economic aspects of the site. And we have this tool to consider the different alternatives that we have for connecting to the grid. So let's look at some of these tools, because these tools are available and can be used right now. I've also spoken a lot about once the plan is operational, we can think about how we can have a good connection and lots of activities for protecting the assets that we set up in this network of nuclear sites. And we're already doing this at Angra 1 and 2, working with diagnostic tools. So these are some of the things that we can do considering the site selection. Thank you so much, Amilcar, for providing us with these contributions for this particular session. Okay, well, now we are reaching the end of this particular session, and keep in mind that we are going to have several roundtables today. We have studies necessary for selecting new sites.
que após
Now
a
I'd also like
expansão
to
da
talk
energia
about the
nuclear.
legal and
Portanto,
regulatory issues
convidamos o
that
senhor
come up
Ricardo
in the
Fraga
nuclear
Guterres,
issue.
diretor
So that
de
is why
Rádio
I am
Proteção e
inviting
Segurança
Mr. Ricardo
Nuclear
Fraga
da
Guterres
Comissão
to
Nacional
tell
de
us
Energia
about
Nuclear, CNEM,
his
que
work
está
at
se preparando
CNEN,
para
the
licenciar
regulatory
reatores de
body
geração 4.
that is getting
Bem-vindo.
ready to license Generation 4
Bom dia a
reactors.
todos. É
Welcome.
prazer enorme poder
Good morning
estar
to you all. It's a
contribuindo nesse
great
debate,
pleasure to be here
da maior
contributing to
relevância.
this debate, which is of
E
great
gostaria de
importance.
primeiramente
And
agradecer o
I'd like
convite,
to, first of all, thank you for
trazer
the
ter a
invitation
oportunidade de trazer
and
aqui a palavra
have the
do órgão
opportunity to
regulador. É
talk
uma honra
from
para
the
nós
perspective
e
of
realmente
the
uma
CNEN,
oportunidade.
the regulatory
Bom,
agency.
como foi mencionado, o
As has
processo de
already been
escolha de
mentioned,
local é processo que
the site
envolve
selection
uma
is a
grande de
process
variáveis,
that
variáveis
includes many
relacionadas
different
à segurança,
variables,
mas não só,
everything related
né?
to safety, but
Há
not only
questões de
safety.
economicidade e
We
logística
have economic
também
issues and logistics
muito
issues
relevantes
that are
na
also very important
escolha
in
do
this site
local
selection.
de reator nuclear. No meu entendimento, essas questões
From my
elas
perspective,
são
these
muito
different
impactadas
issues
pela,
are highly
pela
impacted
questão da
by
abordagem
the
de pequenos e médios
way that
reatores,
we
de
consider
sistemas
small
modulares ou não.
and
Isso por quê?
medium-sized reactors,
Porque,
whether they're
eventualmente,
modular or not.
locais, né,
This
onde
is
a
because the
economicidade não
sites
justifica grande reator,
sometimes
pode
don't
ser
need a
justificado
very
um
large
pequeno reator.
reactor.
Ou mesmo
And so
questões
it would make sense to
logísticas
have a small
locais onde é muito
reactor. But
complicado
then when we have
construir
to think
uma
about
planta grande,
logistics and
podem
the
haver,
difficulty of
imagine, né,
building a large
ainda mais
plant,
no caso de reatores
you could
flutuantes,
potentially do a large plant, but maybe a smaller reactor would make more sense,
Muito bem.
particularly if it's a modular
Dito
reactor.
isso, é importante mencionar que o
Now,
processo
it's also
de
important
escolha
to
de
mention
local
that
não é
the
processo
process for
regulado.
site selection
Né?
is
A
not a
missão do
regulated
órgão regulador
process.
é
Our
assegurar,
mission
uma
at
missão
CNEN
comum ao
is
Estado
to
brasileiro, é uma missão
provide
comum à
access
sociedade brasileira,
and
é uma
to
missão
give a
comum ao
mission
operador e à indústria nuclear, de
that is
assegurar
a
o
mission
seguro
for
da
all of
energia.
us to make sure that
Então, o
nuclear
operador ele considera
energy
seu
is
número de
safe.
variáveis ali,
And
inclusive a
so we have
segurança,
many variables
escolhe o
that
local,
are related
e
to
uma vez
safety.
escolhido esse
Then
local,
once those are
ele
met, then we can
inicia
select
uma
a site
primeira
and
etapa
then
do
we
licenciamento. O
start the
licenciamento
first
nuclear
stage of
é, portanto,
licensing.
composto de várias etapas que cobrem
Since
a
we have many
aprovação do
different
local,
steps in the
a
licensing
construção,
process,
a
we have to
operação
approve the
e
location, then we
número
have to
ainda de
approve the
subetapas
construction,
aí que
and then
compõem
there's
esse
many
processo, que
sub-stages
vão assegurar,
in the
de fato, o
process
uso seguro
that
da
will
energia nuclear.
ensure that
Então, uma
this
vez escolhido o
whole
local,
process and the
o
site is
operador
safe.
ele traz
Once
ao órgão
we go through
regulador
all of this,
essa
then the
escolha
operator
e o órgão
brings to
regulador
the
vai
regulator
verificar
the
os
choice
itens
of the site.
importantes
Then
de
the
segurança,
regulator will
os itens
determine
fundamentais para
whether all
seguro
the
do
items
uso
for safety are
seguro da
being met
tecnologia
and for
nuclear
the use
estão
of
previstos
nuclear
nessa escolha de local.
energy are going to be
Esses
foreseen
itens,
in this
basicamente, eles são
plan.
relacionados
All
com
of
o
these
impacto
items are
concreto
related to
e
a concrete
potencial
impact
de
as well as a
uma planta
potential
nuclear
impact of a
seu
nuclear power
entorno,
plant
na sociedade que está
in
envolvida,
its
como foi já
surroundings.
falado,
And
questões
if it will have an impact
demográficas
on
e
the society
demográficas,
around it,
o
we are
impacto radiológico
considering
de fato é
demographic issues,
considerado,
we're considering radiological
porém,
issues.
também são considerados os
However,
aspectos
we
que o meio
also
ambiente
consider aspects
impacta na
that
planta.
are
E aí nós temos as
related to
questões
the environment and how the environment can
sísmicas,
impact
questões
the
relacionadas à
plant. We're
erupção,
looking at seismic
radiações,
issues and what kind of animal and
contaminação,
wildlife there
enfim,
is
tem
there.
inúmeros parâmetros que são considerados
And there are many
e
different
que o operador deve
parameters that are
demonstrar para o órgão
taken into
regulador, que
consideration
estão
that
avaliados
have to be
entre
shown to
condições de
the
segurança.
regulator
Veja bem,
before
essas
we
funções
can
são
move forward.
extremamente restritivas.
All of these
E
different
eu
criteria and
acredito
steps
que a
are
partir
restrictive.
dessa abordagem
And I
que nós
think that it
temos
is through this
o alto nível
approach
de
that
segurança
we can
das
have a very
plantas
high
nucleares
level of
brasileiras.
security
Eu
and safety
acredito
at
que as
our
novas gerações
nuclear plants.
de
I
reatores
believe that
não
new
vão,
generations
do
of
ponto de
reactors
vista de
will
princípios,
not, from
alterar
a perspective
a
of
abordagem
principles, they
regulatória.
will not
São divididos em
change
princípios.
our
Ou seja,
approach
vai
from the
continuar
regulatory
tendo que
side.
ser demonstrado,
We will
né,
still
que o
require
meio ambiente, que as condições de
demonstration that
segurança
the
que eles
environment and safety and
asseguram
security of the
as
plant
condições de operação dentro
will
das
meet
condições
all the
do
basic
local proposito.
conditions
Condições sísmicas,
that need to be
meteorológicas,
met
como eu falei,
for
relativa
the proposed site.
inundação, disponibilidade de água.
We're talking about flooding,
Da mesma
the
forma, o
availability
impacto
of water. All
no
of
meio
these
ambiente externo
issues
também vai ter que
have
ser
an
demonstrado.
impact on
Do ponto de
where we
vista
select to
específico, quando
place a
esses
plant.
requisitos se traduzem, né,
All of
em
these
requisitos
requirements
específicos, aí sim nós devemos
are
ter uma
translated
alteração,
into
porque as funções de
specific
segurança,
requirements.
obviamente, são impactadas ao
We need
redor do
safety,
inventário,
and safety is
eventualmente no caso do
always
SMS,
an issue.
né?
And we have to think about how
Também as novas
safety can
gerações
be
têm
impacted
sistemas passivos de
depending on the
segurança que
size
têm que ser
of the
considerados como
reactor that we're
altamente
using, like SMRs, for
impactantes da
example.
função de segurança, né?
And so all of this is very
Uma última
important
palavra
for
que eu
safety.
gostaria de mencionar aqui é
Finally,
que a
to wrap things
regulamentação
up,
relativa
I'd like to say
à
that
aprovação do local
regulation
escolhido
and the
deve estar em
approval
revisão,
of the
né?
site
Com uma
is
mudança
divided,
importante que
and things are
nós
changing. This
no processo
change
de
that
licenciamento
we
solicitamos
are
que haja
considering
uma
during
usina
the
de
licensing,
referência, né, uma planta de
because
referência,
we
para que esse processo
require that
ocorra.
there be
E
a
com a mudança de
benchmark
regulamentação
or a
para a
plant of
aprovação do
reference
local, vai ser considerado não uma
to
usina de
be able to
referência,
understand
mas
how
envelope
we
operacional
can
que
set
essa
things
planta
up
vai ter,
in a
né?
new site.
Então, a escolha de
And
local vai
so
passar
these are
a
different things that we have to
ter uma
consider,
abordagem mais
including
flexível,
an
considerando
envelope
o
of
envelope
different issues.
que essa planta vai ter, tá? Em termos de inventário, de geração de energia.
We're talking about
Novamente, muito
inventory
obrigado.
and
Obrigada,
a number of other
senhor
issues.
Guterres.
Thank you very
E agora eu queria
much,
chamar o
Mr.
Leonan
Guterres.
para comentar mais um
Now I'd
pouco
like
sobre
to
a escolha
invite
dos
Leonam
sítios em
to
território
make a
brasileiro,
few more
tendo em
comments
vista
about
todas as
the site
perspectivas que os nossos
selection and
palestrantes
choice
trouxeram agora.
of
Leonan, é
sites
contigo.
here in Brazil. Thank you, Leonam. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you to Amilcar and Ricardo's contributions. Amilcar may not even know about this, but I'm going to tell him here live that I had access to some information. I got this from one of the icons, Mr. Ventura, who worked so hard in the electric field. He gave me a copy of a study that was done back in the 1970s, and it was part of the German-Brazilian relationship, and they considered the most appropriate locations in Brazil to set up the nuclear plants in Brazil. They also considered the grid, and at the time they had the support of IPEN, but they never looked at the electric aspects, but only the safety and socioeconomic factors. And so I think that that's a good point of comparison, and we can work with CEPEL in this, based on this particular study that we had access to. Another thing that I wanted to share with you is the site selection for Angra dos Reis, which is a very interesting site. And that choice was made in the late 1950s under Cafe Filho, the president. And at the time, we were looking at a gas graphite plant with the French. And we were looking at placing this at the Almirante Alberto site. But that location wasn't quite where it is right now. And then when we went on with building Angra 1, we had to consider the technical abilities that we had at the time. And I had access to some of this information recently, and one of your journalist friends, Luna, Denise, she mentioned She has access to some of this information, and she only showed me one page of this study, but she's the one who has it. But I think that there is a historic value that we need to seize. From the perspective that we've talked about here, I think it's very interesting to talk about the site selection because it's very entrepreneurial, and each entrepreneur has to consider all the different factors that go into site selection, and that's quite important. And this idea of the safety envelope is fundamental for making new sites feasible. This is because getting a licensing approval is important and it requires this safety envelope. I think that this is very important. Without that, it's going to be very difficult to take or make any changes in the way that we work in the nuclear sector. And I think that Canaan is really helping us a lot in that sense. And another thing that I'd like to bring up, and I think it's very important as a topic, is that we often talk about SMRs these days. It's kind of like a wave of SMRs right now, but we need to think that these SMRs can be delivered in different ways. You can also consider different factors for their site selection. First of all, the clusters, and you can suddenly bring several different SMRs together to create the energy necessary. Another option is to keep the SMRs isolated, like in the case of the Russian approach. And this idea of a floating reactor in Siberia in a very remote place. So we have several different systems, isolated systems, and clustered systems. And I think that that's interesting when we consider the way that we can deliver these types of reactors. And so in these different aspects, I think that we can have a better conversation going forward. Thank you so much. Thank you, Leonam. Well, now I'd like to take a look at our poll. Let's see the results of the poll, please. We are going to see how many people want, like what the current situation is right now for Brazilian nuclear energy. Most people chose the option of over 20%. So nuclear energy could reach 20% of the grid in Brazil. Leonam, which would be your answer for this poll? How much can we get here in Brazil? I think that's interesting because we have to consider also the people who are watching this particular event. But basically, one of the things that I wanted to say is that from a practical perspective, we didn't talk about the size of our grid, and our national system today has about 200 gigawatts of installed capacity. And so in the horizon, we would require a huge effort, similar to what was done in France, to increase the amount of wind power that is available. Back in the time, France and the world didn't have so many renewable sources of energy, but I think that here maybe this might be a little bit exaggerated when we think about over 20% created by nuclear. But basically, my bet here would be anywhere between 5 and 10% would be an appropriate amount of energy coming from the nuclear sector. In 2050, it would be very positive to have such a large proportion of the energy coming from nuclear sources. Now we're going to take a break, and then we're going to give our guests an opportunity to answer your questions. Thank you. Just a second.
AMP, the Association of Materials Protection and Performance, is a global community of professionals dedicated to materials protection through the advancement of corrosion control and protective coatings, ensuring the maximum performance, integrity, and durability of the assets our society depends on every day. We are the global leaders in protecting assets that build our communities around the world. The 2021 merger of two leading member associations in asset protection, NACE International and SSPC, brought together over 140 combined years of service to members and industry worldwide. Together, under AMP, our membership promotes the protection and performance of steel, concrete, industrial, and commercial structures and surfaces. Become a member and take advantage of exclusive benefits like an expanded career center, an online community and peer network, subscriptions to AMP publications, and exclusive pricing and access to our products and services. Rise to new career opportunities through AMP with online or in-person education courses, training, and certification that validate your knowledge and skill set to the industry. Have your company stand out from the competition by acquiring a QP certification, the internationally recognized program that evaluates the practices of industrial painting contractors. Attend, exhibit, or sponsor one of our many conferences and events around the world as you stay up to date on the latest advancements and technologies in the industry. Subscribe to our magazines, journals, and newsletters to receive relevant and timely real-world content delivered right to you. Purchase books relevant to your line of work, access the most up-to-date industry standards, and even apply for scholarships to help further your education and career. Want to learn more? Visit amp.org.
Welcome to Holtec International, a world leader in engineering, design, and custom manufactured equipment to the energy industry and beyond. Founded in 1986, Holtec has expanded globally with operation centers around the world. Holtec's 4 manufacturing plants use state-of-the-art fabrication and automation tools to create cutting-edge technology and innovative equipment. Holtec's skilled professionals specialize in unique disciplines that include nuclear analysis, specialty engineering, design, and manufacturing. Holtec leads the industry in management of spent nuclear fuel. More than 120 nuclear power facilities rely on Holtec for wet storage rack and insert design and implementation. Over 130 nuclear power plants rely on Holtec for dry storage and transportation equipment and services. This long-standing experience in spent fuel management has now positioned Holtec as a premier leader in decommissioning of shuttered nuclear power plants. Holtec innovation continues to evolve with the design of its SMR-160 small modular reactor, the licensing of the HiStor Consolidated Interim Storage Facility in southeastern New Mexico, a safe, secure, retrievable, temporary storage solution. With innovation that knows no limits and technology that continually evolves, it is clear why we say, Holtec International, a generation ahead by design.
obrigada por permanecerem conosco. Agora vamos às perguntas.
Thank you
Primeiramente,
for
eu
staying
queria
with us.
convidar a senhora Tina
Now let's move
Taylor
on
a
to the
responder a primeira
questions and answers.
pergunta
First of all, I'd like
com
to
comentário depois do
ask
senhor Dibov, que é
Tina
assunto
Taylor
que
for her
vai,
first question.
eu acho que com a experiência que vocês têm internacional, vai ser
Based on
mais
your
interessante
international
ouvir a sua
experience, I think that this
experiência.
is going to be
O
more
Lucas
interesting
Rubio
to hear
está
your
perguntando
experience.
que
Lucas
tipo de
Rubio is
impacto
asking,
social
what
a
kind of
escolha de
social
local para a
impact
construção de uma
does a
planta
site
nuclear pode
location
trazer para o Brasil,
choice for a
tendo em
nuclear
vista,
plant
inclusive, a nossa
have for
situação
Brazil?
socioeconômica?
Considering
Qual é o
our
impacto que uma
socioeconomic
planta dessa pode
situation,
trazer para o
what is
país?
the impact that this site selection can have for a country?
Well, that's a very good question, and the societal needs are really changing all of the time. If I think back to some of the earlier plant siting, a major consideration would have been from the perspective of the plant operator. Can I have access to a workforce that has the skills and capabilities needed to operate the plant? But the conversation now is really flipped to the other direction. Where are there communities that we want to create jobs? Where are there communities where we want to create additional economic opportunities that come about with the availability of clean power? So I see that as one of the major aspects right now is this focus on environmental justice and equity that's going on, where nuclear power can bring a big economic benefit to areas that need it.
Thank you very much. And if Mr. Dibov can also give his perspectives on this idea, that would be wonderful.
Yes, actually, choosing of site selection, it's have a very big influence because, for example, in the beginning of developing of Russian nuclear program, we have some kind of competition between governor of state where nuclear power plants will be placed because they understand it's not only they will have not only huge taxpayer, but they also will have some additional working slots in service industry, in restaurant industry, because it's many people will come for construction, and they will have many people with big salary working in this area after. So we was calculating, and 1 ruble that we invest in construction of nuclear power plant, give 10 rubles additional taxation and additional flow of money for different industry in the region and for the country. So it's huge impact, huge influence, and at least in Russia, when some states have possibility to construct nuclear power plant, it's improving economical indicative of this state. And you also can see in different country where we constructing nuclear power plant. For example, if it's not only about nuclear power plant, I can see about some fresh example. In El Alto, we started to construct nuclear research center, and the price of property around it's increased dramatically because people understand that it will be more organized area with good infrastructure where it will be interesting to live. So it's my opinion about this.
Muito obrigada. Agora eu queria
Thank you
chamar
very
o
much.
Amilcar para
Now
responder
I'd
outra
like to
pergunta.
call on Amilcar to answer another
Amilcar,
question.
o Phil
Amilcar,
Schaefer quer saber quantos
Phil
reatores
Schaaf
o
would
Brasil
like
está
to know how
considerando
many
instalar
reactors
além de Angra
is
e
Brazil
quantos seriam os
considering
pequenos,
after
qual é o
Angra,
potencial, né,
and
de se contratar
what is the potential to
módulos menores, né, os
hire
reatores menores,
SMRs or
e
to
quando que o
build
Brasil
these
pensa em
smaller reactors? And
começar a
when does
construir
Brazil plan to
essas
start
próximas
building
usinas, ou pequenas
these
ou
next
grandes?
power plants, be they large or small?
Exatamente. Por isso que eu
That's
escolhi
the
você,
million dollar
Milka, porque
question.
você ficou
That's
muito
why I
tempo
asked you,
planejando lá na
Amilcar,
terra,
because I
então
knew that
você
this would be a
sabe,
very
né,
difficult one.
quanto
And
do
you
Brasil o
know
planeta
the
precisa.
National Energy Plan very well. Well, basically, if I had a crystal ball, I would be able to tell you, but I don't. But basically, what I can tell you is that even though we don't have a way of quantifying how many we are going to have, what we know is that if you want, first of all, an expansion, and we need an expansion in the electric sector, and that's what we're seeing in the world. And if you want fewer carbon emissions, one of the paths forward is hydrogen. And to create hydrogen, you're going to need electric energy from sources that are that are net zero carbon emitters. And as others have said here, basically quantifying this is very difficult. But Leonam mentioned that he thinks that 200 the 200 gigawatts that we have installed in installed capacity is very interesting, and that it would give us about 40,000 megawatts. So basically, if we think about this installed capacity, it would be hard to make the calculation. Basically, our contribution through nuclear is in terms of energy, fundamentally. Brazil has about 200,000 megawatts, and it's flirting with a situation of rationing energy, and that is serious. We have a hydroelectric base that has been always very important for the Brazilian matrix. You need more power to guarantee electricity in that equation. And then we are thinking about solar energy and wind energy. We are not against these types of energy. They have a role to play, but they are going to demand that the grid have a secure and firm basis for support. And so if we're counting on energy, I think of having 20%, we are going to have a little less than those 40,000 megawatts that Leonam was talking about. But I think that in the future, in 2050 or maybe a little afterward, we need to have a reliable source of energy. It's not, and I think that the most reliable of these sources is the nuclear source. Leonam, can you also tell us a little bit more about what you think about Amilcar's message here? What's your opinion on this? Hi, I brought you in to fight a little bit. So how many reactors do you think that Brazil is going to need and is going to, how many times do we have to replicate Angra? Or how many small modular reactors will we need? Because our audience wants to know. Phil Chafe is asking for this. Well, before I answer this, I'd like to thank Amilcar for his comments. I think that he really helped us understand our installed capacity and also our average capacity, which is rather low, considering how many renewables we have in our grid. We have lower capacity in our new renewable energy sources. And so I think that what he added here was very important. But who am I to say how many reactors we're going to build? I'm only in charge of constructing and operating these different plants. But basically, what I think that we have here is a recommendation which is very clear, and I mentioned it at the beginning of our panel. And it's the National Energy Plan in 2050, which was launched last year, and they make it very clear that all of the interests and all of the work, there was a lot of serious and excellent work that was put into making this plan. But basically, depending on the parameters for expanding solar energy, we expect that by 2050, we need 8 to 10 gigawatts of installed capacity, more than what we have. And so if we think about this in terms of the conventional size of our plants, we're talking about 8 or 10 plants to be implemented by the year 2050. From the perspective of engineering, construction, and financing, I think that it is feasible. Maybe it won't all be achieved by 2050, so we might have to push that horizon back a little further, particularly considering the technical issues that will come up and also the financial issues. But I think that the role of SMRs has not really been very clearly defined in the 2050 energy plan. Basically, we were never part of the actual study for the National Energy Plan. So we have to ask ourselves about how we can include SMRs in the expansion of our gigawatt capacity. The cluster SMRs are very attractive as an option. And then the idea of isolated SMRs is also very interesting, particularly in Roraima, where we have a difficulty supplying energy to the society there, and thinking also about the issues that we're having with Venezuela. And I think that SMRs would be a really great solution for getting through those kind of difficulties that we're facing in those regions. Amilcar, do you have anything you'd like to say? This is no fight right here. We're just talking. But in any case, we're thinking along the same lines. But what I'd like to add to your comments, Leonam, is that we can increase, and this is something that has always been criticized on the nuclear side, is that we are not so flexible, and basically we'll never have full flexibility. But for sure, having SMRs would increase the flexibility. If we can have a site with 4 or 5 or even 6 reactors, and that would give us greater operational capacity with then just having one very large 1,000 megawatt plant. And so I think that I would just add that to your comment. Thank you, Leonam. Thank you to you all. And now I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Guterres. Mr. Guterres, I'd like to know whether CANEM, the regulatory agency, which would be best to answer this. And this is a question from Josué Medeiros. What do you think about elected officials who, in places like Pernambuco, what kind of support or resistance do they have to the site selection for nuclear plants? Do you think that that's something that you have to deal with? Are there regulatory issues that come up with this? Are there any conflicts at the federal, state, or local level? There are, in fact, many cases when you talk about the licensing of sites, not necessarily only for nuclear energy plants, but also you have some issues with licensing. This issue is something that we are constantly looking to smooth over to get licensing. We see this at the federal level too, with IBAMA, for example, but also in other mining companies and mining ministries. There's always a series of requirements, be it with us, with Anvisa in the medical field. But basically, we are always looking for harmonization of the system to smooth things over and make things align. And so, in this political aspect, we are looking at the political issue that is not always addressed by the regulatory body. But I think that there is a relevant aspect on this perspective, which is the regulatory process for licensing. It is a very robust process. And we've shown this to many different forums, just how robust our licensing process is for our dry fuel storage facility, for example. It was a very robust process. And that's even easier than licensing a nuclear plant. But still, we needed 100 technical opinions and hundreds of documents that had to be evaluated, and thousands of pages of studying and dozens of audits that had to be carried out on the site. And all of this helps to guarantee robustness in our regulatory process. And that basically signals how safe our process is. And our industry that brings added value to society and gives jobs to engineers and specialists. This industry is an industry that undergoes a very robust licensing process and has a very high level of safety. Maybe you could answer one of my questions, which is, what's the difference in setting up a large or a small reactor, these smaller reactors that are starting to show up? Would there be a difference, or is it just as complex? The basic safety standards have to be shown to the regulator. But when we talk about specific requirements, for example, when we have the demand for one small reactor in terms of water supply is going to be very different from one of the big reactors that we have at Angra. So these are issues that we have to face. And so things are going to be considered on a case-by-case situation, and the requirements are going to be different. When we have a cluster, obviously, things are going to change too. We're going to have a different approach in terms of the safety protocols. So again, it all comes down to a case-by-case situation. And I think what really has an impact on the licensing is the maturity of the technology. It's not just a change in the type of electric generation, but also a number of other series of issues that can show us a difference in the safety of operating these plants. We have to think about passive systems that are being implemented. For example, what if you don't have a way to ensure safety? Well, that would be something that we'd like to make sure that you can guarantee safety. And so what we have today are a series of backup systems to provide more safety in the case that one system breaks down or is malfunctioning, and that will ensure the safety. With smaller and more modern systems, I think it's going to be easier to show how these safety systems kick in. I'd like to call on Milcar again. What we'd like to know from him is, Josué Medeiros is asking about the sites, and he's saying, how does the production chain work, particularly in the logistics? What is the logistics going to look like for setting up new plants? How do you do that logistics? This is another difficult question for us, but I am going to keep myself to this issue. And since we've already talked about so many different issues, like the issue of having access to water and equipment transportation, all of these are very important. But what we know is that the issue that's going to show up the most in terms of logistics is the electric logistics. So when we think about other plants, unlike hydroelectric plants, nuclear plants, and unlike the other plants that use renewable sources of energy, you will have more restrictions for setting up a certain site, but you have other freedoms. Hydroelectric dams have to be placed where there is water. Wind and solar plants have to be set up where you have access to those two resources. With nuclear, on the other hand, you can basically set it up where you think is best. But there's other logistic issues that are quite important to consider when it comes to site selection. One of those has to do with the infrastructure of the grid. And that's something that we often talk about. Well, thank you so much, Milcar. Okay, we have another question, this time for Tina Taylor. Thinking about the changes in ERPI, how long has it taken to update these studies and the guides, and how long would it take to make the next update?
Well, we're working on the next update now. I think it will be complete next year. And I think that the thing that's important to understand, though, is that between the formal updates, there's a lot of discussion and information sharing as countries are using these paradigms for siting. So there's continuous exchange of lessons learned. But I think our next update will be coming out next year.
Thank you very much. So we're really close. Okay, Leonam, we have another question. This is my own question, in fact, Leonam. This is something interesting because we're talking about nuclear energy and the flexibility for private enterprise in Brazil, and how we could have partnerships between Eletronuclear and the other private companies. Would private enterprise be able to choose where they'd like to set up a nuclear site, or would the government have to make that choice? Who makes the final call? Before answering that question, I'd like to point out something that I think is very important, something that came up in Amilcar's topic on logistics, particularly when we think about new plants. We need to talk about the importance of the resumption of the Angra 3 construction in this whole issue, because basically we are going to reactivate the supply chain and the importance that this supply chain has to the electric and nuclear cycle. And I think that this is very important for Angra 3, and we're going to have to talk about some of the parallel systems or the secondary systems that exist as backup. When we talk about the role of private enterprise, we are talking about a group of companies that are already very active in this sector. When you think that Eletrobras, which is in charge of many of the different sites here, and lots of stocks are available on that belong to Eletrobras, but basically we already have a role for private enterprise because investors can buy parts of Eletrobras. So the capitalization of Eletrobras is only going to help invest more. And so now when we think about the site selection, obviously there are socioeconomic factors that have to come into play. Partners are going to, of course, want to choose one, they're going to have preference over one site versus another. But we always have to think about the total national electric system. The government and private enterprise are all going to have to adapt based on the way things are in the electric system. We have to always find the sites that can give and impart the greatest benefit to the system overall. So I think that in this sense, this is not a personal choice on the side of private enterprise, but rather there are many socioeconomic factors that have to be considered, and we have to think about these economic impact assessments. In 2014, if I'm not wrong, we did a study on the impact of Angra 3, and we identified through that study the study has to be updated because things have changed, but basically we know that Angra 3 is a nuclear plant that has great potential to multiply the GDP of Brazil. And if we increase the GDP of Brazil, we are going to have a ripple effect in the economy. This will help not just the whole country, but it's going to be very beneficial for our society too. Okay, Leonam, well, thank you very much. I think we are at the conclusion of our session. Thank you very much to you all, Tina Taylor, Ivan Dibov, Ricardo Fraga Gutierrez, and Amilcar Guerreiro, and thank you, Leonam. Any final comments, Leonam? Let's see. Please talk to your journalist colleague to see if she can give me more access to that report that I mentioned earlier today. I'll do that. Thank you very much to everyone.
An Embraer Group's company, recognized for its competence in systems integration, is proud to work with focus on innovation and providing the best solutions to its customers. With proven experience in systems engineering and decision support technologies, we develop applications for air traffic management, cybersecurity, command and control, instrumentation, integrated logistics, and asset management. For this, ATEC counts on a team of highly motivated employees and specialists from multidisciplinary areas. In the air traffic management segment, in partnership with the Brazilian Air Force, we develop air traffic control and flow management systems. Our systems offer a set of tools to facilitate real-time decision-taking by controllers. Following strict international standards and procedures, it provides safe and efficient aircraft operations from takeoff to landing. with proven success cases such as the 2014 FIFA Soccer Cup in Brazil and the 2016 Olympics in Rio de Janeiro, attest the credibility of our solutions. ATEC systems are also used in other countries. Reliability, integration, and interoperability reaching the world. Providing solutions for defense and public safety, ATEC offers surveillance, protection, and control in air, land, sea. Our strong experience in developing critical systems can be observed with solutions for command and control, embedded systems, simulation, instrumentation and control, cyber defense, and training academy. Huge projects such as CIVAN, Surveillance and Defense, LabGene, Nuclear Control, and Ajax-BR, Mission and Combat, prove the high expertise and competence presented by ATEC along its history. For the corporate market, ATEC offers logistics, asset management, cybersecurity, and operational efficiency solutions for companies in different segments such as aerospace, oil and gas, agribusiness, mining, and utilities. Being able to understand our customers' needs is our inspiration. We strive for solutions that contribute to making their business efficient and secure. ATEC, a world leader in technology solutions.
Desde o início de sua trajetória no planeta Terra, o homem luta para dominar a natureza em busca de sobrevivência. As primeiras descobertas meramente intuitivas e casuais foram, com o tempo, dando lugar a um pensar engenhoso, racional e objetivo. A história da humanidade é feita de construção e de reconstrução, de aperfeiçoar o que foi realizado e de inventar novas formas de fazer. Inovamos no mercado de construção civil e de montagem industrial, sempre comprometidos com a excelência e a ética. Inovamos ao desenvolver projetos sustentáveis para diferentes setores da economia. Inovamos em estabelecer uma conduta ética compartilhada e reafirmada em um rígido programa de compliance. Nossa qualidade é reconhecida nos projetos que entregamos. Porém, o mais importante reconhecimento está na satisfação dos nossos clientes e na realização profissional de nossos colaboradores. Engetec Brasil. Nosso jeito de fazer é inovação.